There's a category of evidence almost nobody thinks to look for because it isn't hiding in a text message or a conversation or an argument you can replay in your head later. It's hiding in your physical space, in the actual tangible arrangement of your own home. And once you know what to look for, you'll realize it's been quietly telling you the truth about a relationship long before you were ready to hear it any other way. Today we're talking about the specific things, physically present in a home, that reveal a controlling or narcissistic dynamic is at play. Signs so easy to walk past every single day that most people never consciously register what they actually mean. Let's start with why physical space reveals this kind of truth so reliably, because it's worth understanding the mechanism before we go through the specific signs. Conversations can be managed, tone can be controlled, explanations can be crafted carefully in the moment to smooth over almost anything. But a home is lived in constantly, day after day, without the same level of conscious performance that goes into a conversation. Patterns that would never be admitted to directly tend to show up almost involuntarily in how space actually gets used, controlled, and divided between two people. Because arranging a shared environment happens gradually, unconsciously, revealing exactly how power actually distributes in a relationship, regardless of what either person would say about it if asked directly. The first thing to look for: spaces in the home that are unmistakably theirs alone, with no equivalent space that's unmistakably yours. This might look like an entire room, an office, a garage, a specific chair that's silently, permanently understood to be off limits, paired with the complete absence of any space in the home that carries that same protected, undisturbed status for you. This asymmetry is worth paying close attention to because healthy shared living, even when people have different needs for personal space, usually produces some rough parity, both people having somewhere that's genuinely theirs, even if the specific arrangement looks different for each person. When one person's space is protected and sacred while the other person's needs for the same thing are treated as unnecessary, inconvenient, or simply never discussed at all, that asymmetry is quietly revealing something real about whose comfort the home is actually organized around. The second thing to look for: decisions about shared spaces, furniture, decor, even something as simple as which shows get watched in the living room, that consistently reflect one person's preferences with the other person's input either absent entirely or treated as a formality that gets overridden anyway. This is worth noticing carefully because it rarely announces itself as a single, dramatic override. It shows up gradually in small accumulated decisions until one day you look around a home you supposedly built together and realize almost nothing in it actually reflects your own taste, your own preferences, your own sense of what feels comfortable. Because every small negotiation, over months or years, quietly resolved in the same direction until the direction itself became invisible, simply how things are rather than a pattern anyone consciously chose. The third thing to look for: evidence of monitoring, subtle or overt, built into the physical structure of the home itself. Security cameras positioned to observe your movements rather than genuinely protect the property. A home office door that stays open specifically when you're in a certain part of the house, a habit of leaving certain doors unlocked or ajar that seems designed less for convenience and more for maintaining visual access to wherever you happen to be. This kind of environmental monitoring often gets rationalized with perfectly reasonable sounding explanations: safety, convenience, and open concept preference. But the actual test is whether the monitoring runs in both directions equally, or whether it's structured specifically to keep tabs on one person's movements while leaving the others completely private and unobserved. The fourth thing to look for: financial records, mail, or important documents that are consistently, deliberately kept in a location you don't have easy or comfortable access to, even in a home you technically share equally. This might look like a locked drawer, a password-protected filing system, an office that's technically shared, but where certain paperwork always somehow ends up filed away before you have a chance to review it. This pattern matters because genuine partnership usually involves reasonably transparent access to shared financial information and a consistent, structural barrier to that access. one that exists specifically around finances rather than any other category of document, often reveals an intentional effort to control information as a form of broader control over the relationship itself. The fifth thing to look for, the complete absence of any physical trace of your independent life before the relationship, photographs, mementos, items connected to friendships or family relationships that existed before you met this person, quietly missing from the home's visible decor, while items connected to the other person's history remain prominently displayed. This is one of the more subtle signs, because it often happens gradually enough that you don't consciously notice the specific moment your grandmother's photo came down, or your college memorabilia got boxed up to declutter, while equivalent items from their own history stayed exactly where they were. This pattern often reflects something deeper, a slow erasure of the version of you that existed independently before this relationship, replaced by a home environment that increasingly reflects only their history, their preferences, their sense of what the space should represent. The sixth thing to look for, household rules or routines that exist specifically to manage your behavior, dressed up in language that makes them sound practical or reasonable, while no equivalent rules apply to the other person's behavior in the same domain. A specific, enforced curfew for when you're expected to be home, justified as safety, while their own comings and goings remain completely unstructured. A requirement that you check in before making plans with friends, framed as courtesy, while the same courtesy is never extended or expected in return. These asymmetric rules, especially once you list them out together rather than considering each one in isolation, often reveal a system of behavioral management operating under the surface of what sounds, individually, like reasonable household consideration. I want to say something important here because it's easy to hear a list like this and start anxiously auditing every small asymmetry in your own home, even ones that don't actually indicate anything concerning. Not every difference in space usage, decision-making, or household rules reflects control. Sometimes it genuinely reflects different needs, different working arrangements, different practical circumstances that have nothing to do with power imbalance at all. The actual signal worth paying attention to isn't any single item on this list in isolation. It's the pattern, multiple signs, consistently pointing in the same direction, accumulating over time, always resolving in favor of the same person's comfort, preferences, and control, while the other person's needs in the same domains go consistently unaddressed. And this is exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. What it actually looks like to test whether these patterns reflect genuine, addressable circumstance or something more concerning, how to have an honest conversation about reclaiming physical space and shared decision-making without it turning into another round of the same imbalance, and why the home you live in, once you finally see it clearly, so often reveals a truth about the relationship that words alone had been carefully obscuring the entire time. Let's talk about how to actually test whether these patterns reflect something genuinely addressable, or something deeper and more concerning, because the goal here was never to hand you a checklist that automatically diagnoses a relationship. It was to give you a way of finally seeing something that's been hiding in plain sight, and seeing it clearly is only useful if it leads to an honest, deliberate next step. Here's the first test, and it's simpler than it sounds. Name one specific pattern out loud, calmly, without accusation, and watch closely not just what gets said in response, but what actually changes afterward. Something as direct as, "I've noticed I don't really have a space in this house that's just mine the way your office is just yours. I'd like to change that," gives you real information in how it's received. A person who simply never thought about the asymmetry, who genuinely didn't intend for the home to be organized this way, will usually respond with some mixture of surprise and willingness, maybe even embarrassment that it took this long to notice, followed by an actual visible effort to correct it. This is worth naming clearly, because plenty of household imbalances develop through simple inattention rather than deliberate control, and inattention responds very differently to being named than intentional control does. A person whose control over the space was actually serving a deeper need to manage you will respond very differently, and the tell is almost always in the quality of the pushback rather than its mere existence. Reasonable pushback sounds like practical negotiation, That makes sense. Let's figure out which room could work. I hadn't thought about it that way. Concerning pushback sounds like minimization, deflection, or a subtle reframing of your reasonable request into evidence of your own unreasonableness. Why do you suddenly need your own space? Is something going on with us? Or, I don't understand why this matters so much to you. Delivered in a way that makes the simple request itself feel like the actual problem, rather than the years-long asymmetry that prompted it. The second test involves watching what happens over the following weeks, not just in the immediate conversation. This matters because performative agreement, enthusiastic verbal acknowledgement followed by zero actual behavioral change, is one of the most common ways these patterns get maintained without ever needing to be openly defended. If you name the space asymmetry and get a warm, validating response, but a month later, nothing has actually shifted, no space has actually been designated, no real effort has been made to correct the imbalance, this gap between words and behavior is itself extremely important data, arguably more important than the original conversation, because it reveals whether the acknowledgement was genuine or simply the fastest way to end an uncomfortable moment without ever intending to follow through. The third test, and this one requires more courage than the first two, bring up more than one pattern at once, deliberately, and see whether naming several examples together produces genuine reflection or produces an escalating defensive reaction that grows in proportion to how many patterns you've named. This matters because a single named asymmetry can sometimes be waved away as an isolated, reasonable circumstance, even when it isn't. But naming several together, the space, the decor decisions, the monitoring, the financial access, the missing photographs, the asymmetric rules, makes it far harder to dismiss any individual one as coincidental, which is exactly why a person who's actually invested in maintaining control over the relationship will often react far more intensely to the cumulative pattern being named than to any single item on its own. The intensity of that reaction, more than anything else, tends to reveal how much the arrangement was actually serving them. Now, I want to talk honestly about what a genuinely healthy response to this entire process actually looks like, because it's important not to walk away from this episode assuming every home imbalance reflects deep pathology. A healthy partner, upon having these patterns named clearly and specifically, usually experiences some real discomfort. Nobody enjoys realizing they've been unconsciously prioritizing their own comfort at someone else's expense. But that discomfort translates fairly quickly into genuine curiosity and effort, rather than defensiveness that lingers or escalates. They ask questions. They want specifics about what would actually feel better to you. They follow through on small, concrete changes without needing to be reminded repeatedly. And crucially, they don't require you to manage their emotional reaction to the conversation, the way a controlling partner often does, turning your reasonable request into something you now have to apologize for or soften in order to keep the peace. I want to say something important about reclaiming physical space specifically because this is often one of the more concrete, achievable steps available to someone recognizing these patterns, regardless of how the larger relationship conversation unfolds. Even in a relationship where the deeper dynamic remains genuinely uncertain, actually establishing one small, protected space that's unmistakably yours. A corner of a room, a specific chair, a drawer, anything that carries the same protected status. The other person's space has always carried, serves a purpose beyond the practical. It becomes a small, tangible test of whether your stated needs actually get respected once they're stated clearly. A low-stakes way of gathering real evidence about how this specific relationship handles your boundaries before deciding what larger conclusions that evidence might support. I want to be honest about something before we close, because it matters more than any individual test we've walked through today. If, after clearly naming these patterns, after giving genuine opportunity for change, after watching behavior over real time rather than just words in a single conversation, the patterns persist exactly as they were. The space remains theirs alone. The decor decisions remain one-sided, the monitoring continues, the financial access stays restricted, your own history stays quietly absent from the walls, the rules stay asymmetric. This isn't a communication problem waiting for the right words to finally unlock it. It's information about what this specific relationship actually is, underneath whatever language gets used to describe it. And that information deserves to be taken seriously rather than explained away indefinitely, hoping that one more conversation, one more attempt at clarity will finally produce the shift that months or years of evidence have already shown isn't coming. I want to leave you with an image because I think it captures everything we've walked through today better than any explanation could. Picture a house built originally with two full sets of rooms, a wing for each person who was meant to live there, symmetrical, balanced, designed from the very first blueprint to hold two lives equally. But over years of actually living inside that house, something happens slowly enough that neither person consciously registers the moment it starts. One wing gradually expands, room by room, decision by decision, while the other wing quietly contracts, shrinking under the weight of 1,000 small compromises that never got named clearly enough to be recognized as compromises at all. Eventually, if nobody ever stops to look at the whole floor plan honestly, one person is living in a house that's grown to fill nearly every available room, while the other has been pushed gradually into a single corner that used to be an entire wing of their own, not through any single dramatic act of eviction, but through years of small, individually forgettable decisions that, added together, redrew the entire structure of the home without either person ever consciously deciding that's what should happen. Here's what matters about finally seeing this floor plan clearly, after years of simply living inside it without stepping back to look at the whole shape. Seeing it doesn't require immediately tearing the house down. Sometimes, seeing it clearly, naming it honestly, and watching what happens next reveals a partner who's genuinely startled by how lopsided things became, someone who moves quickly and sincerely to rebalance the space once they actually see the same floor plan you're seeing. And sometimes, seeing it clearly reveals something else entirely, a house that was never actually designed to be shared equally in the first place, no matter how symmetrical the original blueprint might have looked on paper before anyone ever moved in. Either way, the person standing in that shrinking corner deserves to know clearly which kind of house they're actually living in, because a life spent quietly adjusting to smaller and smaller spaces, hoping the walls will eventually stop closing in on their own, is no way to live inside a home that was always supposed to hold you as fully and as comfortably as it holds anyone else standing under the very same roof.